Greetings, Princeps, and welcome to the 55th episode of the God Engine Cast, a podcast dedicated to discussing the Adeptus Titanicus wargame produced by Games Workshop. In this show, we're going to discuss scenarios, looking at the best practices for playing a game of Titanicus to ensure that you and your opponent both have a really fun game. Before we get to today's show, a huge thank you to everyone who's supporting me through Patreon and my Ko-Fi page. If you want to help support the show, please check out my Patreon and Ko-Fi page. I'm going to be sitting down and reviewing my Patreon and Ko-Fi pages here soon, changing things up and looking for additional ways that I can support those individuals who support this show. So thank you very much. All that said, as always, the best way to support the show is help drive the algorithms that let others find this show. So please share the show with friends, please write positive reviews, and leave positive likes where possible. Thank you so much. So before we get on to the actual content of this week's show, let me once again talk about the Iron Halo. The Iron Halo GT in Bartlesville, Oklahoma at the end of September is going to have a Titanicus event once again that I am going to be running. I have spent the last 2 weeks putting together the basic event pack and basic mission ideas. I've posted those up on social media. Please give them a review and a comment. I am taking feedback at the moment for the core mission pack. If things aren't clear, if there are FAQs you think I need to add, please let me know. I want to make sure this document is thorough and covers anything anyone will need during the event in the fall. In addition, we still have space at the event, so please feel free to sign up. If you go to the event list and we are sold out, I will be working on finding additional tables. I have initially set out to have 4 tables for Titanicus, but I know I'm able of pushing that to 6 or 8 should I need to, so please sign up. I will sort of add that if we fill up with only a few weeks to go, I may not have the capacity to expand the event. Expanding the event will have a cut-off date, so if you really want to go, get your name on the list now to avoid disappointment. The next episode of the God Engine Cast will discuss the Iron Halo a little more when I sit down with Lucas to go through the event pack and we start talking about some of the big ideas I am going to be playing with at this year's event. So a few weeks ago, I put a call out to the community to help me find topics to talk about on this show. And one of the topics that was frequently mentioned was the idea of what missions should you be playing to have a fun game of Titanicus? Alongside other questions about what did I think of the open war engine cards and perhaps the narrative missions in the core game. All these ideas sort of coalesced into what's going to be this episode. I realised there hasn't really been a huge amount of time spent in the Titanicus community talking about how you make sure a game is good past what army list you pick. And I think there's a huge gap in the conversation there, so I'm going to try and fill it with this episode, at least to start people thinking about it. Since the release of the Titanicus core game, we've had a lot of different ways to put together scenarios for a game of Titanicus. From the core rulebook with its asymmetric warfare system, to the individual narrative missions, to the recent open war deck, or even the Echoes of Glory missions found in the Crucible of Retribution book. So let's start at the top and discuss the match play system from the core Titanicus rulebook. This is a subject I've touched on before in episode 19 and 21, I believe. The first one where I review the system, and the next time where I sit down with Graham Sanders to review his version of this match play system. Both systems, though, have the same basic premise. The players will be using missions that they individually pick. It's asymmetrical warfare. And this leads to a very interesting gameplay. You could be trying to do something on the table completely opposite to what your opponent's trying to do. And while I consider the Graham Sanders mission pack pretty well balanced in that regard, the original core Titanicus missions aren't. Inevitably, the game breaks down to kill points, as you have a much higher chance of rolling the kill point mission, and it scores so much higher. And as you get to roll twice, you generally are going to pick the kill point mission. And once one side's running kill points and the other's still trying to get an objective across the table, the game is pretty much set to be, lining up and shooting at each other until both sides are destroyed. And maybe if one player's lucky, they will survive with enough Titans to get their objective across the table and win the game. But if they've won the game through being able to get a Titan to the enemy's objective point, they've usually been able to stop the enemy scoring that many victory points anyway. So to many folk who sat down and really thought about strategies just to being able to accomplish the mission, the core rulebook strategies are all pretty similar. Now, as I just mentioned, the Graham Sanders mission pack messes this up. He adds a whole pile more different objectives and removes the kill point objective completely. This creates a much more balanced mission pack and is a really fun way to play this original thought process that was behind Titanicus. A really good way to play the asymmetrical warfare that I think was the initial intent by the initial writing team. And as a match play system, it works pretty well. In fact, it was the system I used for the Iron Halo 2020. Though I think the Iron Halo 2021 is going to be using a different system that we will talk about in passing here in a few moments. So before we go any further, let's take a moment to discuss open narrative and matched play. In the core rulebook, these ideas are pretty well nailed down. The open war means rocking up to a table with whatever models you want to fight against whatever models your opponent wants to fight, and playing a mission you both sort of agree to. In narrative play, you sort of pick everything based from the scenario guidelines, from your choice of units, which sometimes can be described in full, through to what stratagems you get to use. In match play, everything is divided by points to try and make the game balanced for competition-style environments. And that's kind of how it's written out in the core book. It isn't very well applied, though, because even within the narrative missions, it talks about points. So suddenly the narrative missions are using match play systems. So the match play system suddenly just becomes that particular style of rolling missions together, which, as I've just discussed, isn't that great. But people still want to use points, because points is a great way to balance the game, so people start applying points to other things. The main thing people apply points to in the sort of largest section of conversation for this particular episode of this podcast is the Open Engine War card pack. When the open war decks started appearing in 40k and Age of Sigmar, they were there for open play. They were a deck of cards you could pick and draw a random mission, and then play with whatever models you felt like it. But that didn't last long. I know every time I've used an open war deck, I have used it with a pointed list. I'll show up to a game and say, I'm going to bring 2,000 points of models, let's just throw an open war mission together and play a game. So the other day, I played a game of 40k, first one I played in a long time, but I actually used an open war deck in a narrative mission alongside some match play rules. Yeah, we mixed all three together to make a fun gaming experience. We weren't constrained to stay in these swimming lanes that Games Workshop have laid out. I really like the idea that they've got this dedicated open war and narrative string to their bow, if you would. Because it ensures that the Games Workshop are producing aren't just solely dedicated on the competitive style of play. But I think once you get outside the game studio, the lines between these styles of play become kind of meaningless, and I know I'm not going to refer to it again. I'm going to discuss the Open Engine War card pack as if you're playing it in a match play setting. A match play setting is a great set of ground rules that allows you to rock up to a gaming store and have a random pickup game with another person playing Titanicus. And that's what I think they're useful for. The open war system is really there where you've got a good buddy and you know exactly what you're doing. You've already got that social contract. But I think this is pretty well covered ground in our gaming media, so I'm going to move on to discuss the open war deck. So, the Open Engine War deck. Let's start at the top. Yes, this item is out of production. Yes, this item was made in very limited quantities, so not everyone has a set of these cards. You can still find them online for ever-increasing prices. And I think, on the whole, $75 a deck, which is what I saw them being sold as yesterday, is too expensive for what they are.
That said, this deck of cards, this quick release Games Workshop did, is the best mission generating system for Titanicus so far. Now I have started using it to play my games of Titanicus, I'm going to be hard pressed not to continually use it for every game I play. It is fast, it is efficient, and it gives some really interesting games. It not only gives games that are balanced and force you to play a game in a fun way, it also sets a bit of a narrative in place, which is really good. And I think we can discuss the open war deck as I'm about to do, and not look at what the cards do, but how they do what they do. So you can, if you don't have your own deck of these cards, try to recreate the flavor of the open engine war missions, despite the fact you may not have your own deck. Because I think at the end of the day, that's what they get right. This deck is the first time Games Workshop have published a mission pack that really gets Titanicus. It sets missions that play to the rules that make sure you're going to have a good game nearly every time you get to a table. And that is really impressive. So I think that's going to be the focus of our conversation today. So don't expect a deep review of the product. I haven't done one. I did a cursory one when it first came out. And I'm not going to. This is a product that is out of publication. Most folk who don't have a deck now are never going to get a deck unless Games Workshop put out a new version. So I'm not going to dig into it. We're just going to look at the lessons we can learn from this wonderful deck of cards.
So that leads us to the question of how does the Open Engine War card deck work? Well, the deck itself is made of 5 sub-decks. A deck for maps, a deck for primary objectives, a deck for secondary objectives, a deck for planetary effects, and a deck for battlefield effects. When you're generating your mission, you draw a couple of cards from this deck, one from each of the sub-decks, a couple from the secondary objective deck, which we'll get to in a minute. And this then describes the mission you're going to play. Now, I've got a way I put this deck together, or a way I draw from these cards, as I go through the pre-game process. I don't draw all the cards at once. I draw them through different stages of the pre-game process with my opponent as we build a really fun game. So I'm going to discuss these sub-decks in that order and why I put them in that order. I'm going to make reference to this process of putting together an Open Engine War game when I start reviewing the other systems that Games Workshop have given us in the other publication materials, and as I start looking at ways you can put together your own Open Engine War missions, even if you don't have a deck. So when I'm starting a game, the first card set I draw from is the planetary effects. This is a deck of 10 cards that basically describe what type of planet you are fighting the battle on. These have options from Shattered Worlds, which is a world that is about to fall apart, to Hive Cities, to Forge Worlds, to Toxic Wastelands, to Arctic Worlds. And they all come with a sort of effect that will affect the entire battlefield. But they also sort of describe the scenery that you're going to have. In fact, the Hive World card basically says, if you draw this card, ensure your battlefield has a dense amount of buildings on it. So I always draw the planetary effect first, and then build the table that I'm going to play on to match the card I've drawn. So I draw that card first, basically as soon as me and my opponent meet. Or if my opponent has a delay and I'm building the battlefield before he arrives, it is a card I will draw without them. I will draw a card and then build the table around that. At which point we draw the deployment map card and the primary objective card. Now this is the cool thing about the Open Engine War deck, that there are 9 deployment maps and they are very varied. So once I've drawn the deployment map card, I generally have to then go and assess the table to see whether the deployment map is going to work on the scenery we put together. The other week I played a game and I realised that once we had the mission objectives and the deployment maps, the scenery we deployed would have led to a very boring game. So we moved the scenery around a little bit, pushing it out to the sides. Nothing major, just enough to keep the game interesting. The primary objective card is drawn, and there's only one card. There are 6 primary objectives in the deck, so you don't get a huge amount of selection, but all the primary objectives are really interesting. With the exception of the kill point mission, all of the objectives are about getting into your opponent's deployment zone or closer to their table edge, or at least in part. Which means you're going to be guaranteed a game where you're going to close in on your opponent and actually have to move. This is something that's a bit of a problem in the match play missions, with things like retrieval being very stationary if you're able to pull it off correctly. Once me and my opponent had drawn the deployment map and the primary objective and adjusted the battlefield where necessary, we then draw our secondary objectives. My opponent and myself both draw 2 cards from this 12-card deck. We pick one of the cards in secret and return the others to the deck. These secondary objectives have a wide variety of options within them. Some are about killing particular titans, some are about killing titans in a specific way, say with targeted attacks or with melee attacks. Others are about getting titans to the enemy deployment zone, putting banners on the table, securing center objectives, and the like. They are all fairly good, but if I had a criticism with the mission objectives here, is that the secondary objectives here do have a tendency to be very similar in places to the primary objectives. It isn't that hard to draw a primary objective and a secondary objective that will ask you to do the same thing. Now, in a mission design's thought process, that's actually pretty bad. If I'm a TO and I'm trying to put together a mission pack, I want to avoid that. I don't want a player to be able to double score a pile of victory points for doing the same thing. It means that should they be able to achieve the objective, they're going to win the game. And should they fail, they are going to have no chance of winning. It's an eggs in your one basket scenario. I think I'll talk about this more with Lucas next week. It's a pretty complicated idea. It's something I try and avoid, and it is my criticism of the Open Engine War deck. And like I say, I will talk about it more in the future. So at this point, once we've drawn the secondary objectives, though, we then pick strategy. And most of the time we deploy, depending on my opponent. We get ready for the game. But before we roll off to see who gets the first turn, we draw the final card, which is the battlefield effect. These can be pretty interesting things, from like a lightning storm rolling across the battlefield to the fact the battlefield is soaked in radiation. These have a simple effect that are described on the card and add an added twist to the game. I like drawing these after stratagems as it stops the players from being able to pick a stratagem to ignore the effect or something. It's something that you're going to have to react to and think about. So that's the system. A unique deployment map, one primary objective that both players are trying to achieve, a secondary objective that individual players try and achieve and they get picked for themselves, and then 2 random battlefield effects to mix up the games. Now we've sort of gone over what the Open Engine War deck does. I think it's pretty easy for us to start extrapolating out a system for you to create your own Open War deck if you haven't been able to get this deck of cards yourself. All you need to do is assemble some tables to randomize the different parts of the deck. So you're looking for deployment maps, primary objectives, secondary objectives, and planetary and battlefield effects. And I've got some good ideas of where you could look for these randomized tables.
For the primary objectives, I encourage you to look at the Graham Sanders mission pack. I mentioned it there at the start of the show. His primary objectives are really good. Most of them do encourage movement across the table. Instead of rolling the 2 as he describes and then secretly keeping one for yourself, just roll the 1, apply it to both players. Then have players roll the 2 secondary missions, again from the Graham Sanders pack. It's a really simple selection. It's available on his webpage or through the Mournival rules that are basically the same. And then finally, the secret source of the Open Engine War cards is the planetary and battlefield effects. And there are rules for those effects already in existence if you have collected all the source books for the Titanicus game, or if you've even just got one of the source books, providing it isn't Loyalist, Legios, or Crucible of Retribution. You see, the initial 4 source books all came with Appendix 1, Battlefields of blah. These were descriptions of the battlefields found within the narratives. They composed a series of special rules that could be applied to a battlefield to give a narrative theme. For example, the Titan Death book is the hostile battlefields. You have Beta Garmin 2, which describes what Beta Garmin 2 is, with the special rules being minefields, chain reactions, and pitfalls to represent the fact this is a war world. In the Defense of Raza, there are the Battlefields of Raza options in Appendix 1, which talk about how to play in Manufactoria or in Plasmic Infrastructure. These again have 3 special rules apiece, all of which are kind of fun. So what I would do if I didn't have an open war deck is I would get a piece of paper, I would write out all these options of different battlefields, and then assign a number to it, and then have a randomizer, like a dice. Roll the table, pick which battlefield you're on, and use those special rules. Now, I would say a lot of these battlefield ofs are problematic in the rules are a little bit complicated. I think they did something really sensible with the Engine War cards of limiting the number of special rules to 2. Having 3 special rules on every battlefield can get a little bit clunky. So I would recommend that when you pick your battlefield, you randomise, you roll your dice, you pick your battlefield, and then you pick 2. It will give you 3 special rules. You and your opponent pick the 2 special rules you want to play with, which I think would go a long way to streamlining this particular set of rules. And in fact is what I did last year at the Iron Halo. I went through all these battlefield of rules, picked the one for every table I wanted, and then actually, for the first day, just had one of the special rules in play on each one of the tables. Within day 2, I introduced a second rule. Slowly built the complexity because I had a lot of new players. And I'm going to be doing something very similar this year. So that's how I would make my own open war deck if I didn't have it. A kind of ad hoc, simple version, but I think you'd get a very similar effect and get the joy of this new way of playing Titanicus. So let's now have a look at some other ways you could play Titanicus if you're perhaps wanting something a little bit more structured. Let's look at the preset missions.
If you're not going to use the Open Engine War card deck to select a mission or the standard match play mission system, your other option to play a mission of Titanicus is to use one of the preset missions found in the narrative sections of the Titanicus sourcebooks or the Echoes of Glory rules found in the sourcebook Crucible of Retribution. These are missions that have been defined with a preset deployment zone, a preset victory method, and some special rules. And they're designed to play out a particular narrative that the game designers were pushing. Most of the source books have preset missions that are exactly targeted to the story told within that book, and then the Echoes of Glory sort of list individually themed battles that you can play on a number of worlds. There's like 18 different preset missions back there. It's a whole pile of them, some really fun ones. And for the most part, these are all pretty good. If you can find yourself a good preset mission, you and your opponent can have a quick and fun setup with not much mucking around rolling dice. You can get stuck straight into the action and have a narrative and enjoyable game of Titanicus. But there are a number of problems and things you need to be aware of when picking that preset mission. Although there are a couple of places you can roll on random tables, especially for the Echoes of Glory, I really advise against it. As I said, there are a number of problems with these missions, and they are really not that great for that pickup game. Or, if you're a tournament organizer saying these are the missions we're going to do and just pick, 6 random presets. The system doesn't work like that. A preset mission quite often has to be picked months, weeks in advance to make sure you've got the scenery, the right forces, and occasionally the right legios to play the mission. Although many of the narrative missions allow you to swap the legios out, several of them don't, and they are kind of important to the narrative. Let's look at what would make a good preset mission. We're going to go through this by breaking down the standard steps that the descriptions of these preset missions are broken down in. We're going to look at the battlefield, we're going to look at the battle groups, we're going to look at deployment, and then we're going to look at the mission special rules, and then finally the victory conditions. So the first aspect of a preset mission is the battlefield. This is the section that describes the terrain needed for the game and the size of table needed. The best missions you can play, the missions you will enjoy the most, are the ones that you have the correct scenery for and do not come with a weird table size. Most Titanicus games are played on a 4x4, but some of the narrative missions want you to be playing on a 4x6, or even weirder, with ones with long tails of a 2x2 stretching off. And those missions just aren't that great if you're just going to be doing it in a hurry. They're missions that are probably good fun to play, but you've got to put a lot of thought into it. If a mission requires a piece of specialized scenery, you probably want to make sure you've got that scenery to get the full immersion in that particular story. So you've got to make sure you balance that particular battlefield requirement. But there is a judgment call. I mean, you can get away with doing quite a bit if you're okay with proxies. If you've got a map that has a giant chasm in it, are you okay with marking stuff with a piece of string? Or do you want to actually model in a giant chasm? It's not that hard to do, probably, to print one off on some paper. But again, it's something you probably want to be establishing a few days beforehand so you can get the necessary things in place. There are some with really complicated pieces of scenery where it wants you to have bridges over a chasm or a giant siege wall or something. I know some of my listeners have such
pieces of scenery, and it's great there are battles that use them. But for people who just want a random pickup game, it is something you're going to have to check the requirements of fairly closely. And I think, to be honest, that is a fairly obvious thing to state. Make sure you have the requirements of Battlefield. Also, and this is this big flag, although you may have a 6x4 gaming table, because that's what you play your games of Horus Heresy 40k on, really consider whether you want to take Titanicus up to that scale. As soon as you do that, you've got to find space for all your terminals, and that becomes a bit of a problem. I struggle sometimes to keep my terminals in the 1 foot square that we assign each other when I'm playing my opponent. So obviously we play on a 4x6, and I've got my 1 foot square for all my terminals, and in big games not all my terminals fit there, so I'm already pushing to different sides, and I've taken card tables up to events, so I've got a place to put more terminals. And when you start doing the full 4x6 game, you are going to need every ounce of space you can get. And yeah, that can be a bit problematic for people who are space conscious, especially those folk who live in Europe, I'm sure, really struggle with those missions. But anyway, something to keep in mind. But all that stuff can be overlooked and worked around, and I don't think any of that will really affect your fun hugely if both you and your opponent buy in. Providing you've got the space and providing you've got the terrain, it's not a huge issue. Even if you end up proxying, you can still have a good bit of fun. After all, there's a lot of imagination being used in a game of Titanicus anyway. Adding a little more to pretend that dotted line is a giant chasm isn't really that hard, if it will look a little weird for photos, if that's a consideration of yours. But the next category of battle groups is one you need to think long and hard about. This is probably going to be the biggest tangent of this episode, and we're going to go into some pretty weird space here. But I think this is the one that really needs to be thought of a lot when you're playing a preset mission. And that is the size of the game and asymmetry of the forces. So let's talk about asymmetry. And sadly, we're also going to talk once again about the activation game, that thing that's ever present when you're thinking about strategies in Titanicus. Titanicus has been set up in the base game to allow for forces of different sizes to fight each other. The confrontation style game allows the forces of 1,250 to fight forces of 1,750. And it talks that both sides are able to win, and it gives some bonuses to the underdog, as you will. They would get an extra 2 stratagem points to somehow make up for their smaller force. The problem is that when you actually get down to brass tacks and we actually start fighting the game out, being able to take an extra warlord over your opponent is a huge thing. Even if the game was a Ben Davis special and everyone just took the Corsair Maniple and you just had Reavers running around the table, the ability to have one more Reaver than your opponent, or one free Reaver effectively, means that you would win the activation game, which means you could force fire on the enemy a little harder, which means you could take out their Titans a little bit quicker. And with every Titan you destroy, that activation gap grows and grows, allowing you to focus fire more and more, thus pushing that advantage to greater and greater levels. At the end of the day, giving someone 2 stratagem points for being the underdog isn't enough to balance that bonus. The activation game, the activation advantage in Titanicus is huge. It's why we talk about it so much on this podcast. It comes up any time we discuss list building. And it should also come up any time you discuss mission builds. If you're going to play a mission that forces one side to be smaller than the other, you need to look very carefully and see what advantages it's giving that defender. And you've got to make that gut decision. Is this enough to overcome the activation advantage the opponent is going to have? And the problem is the activation advantage comes up so much in the missions in these presets. And that's because it's a cultural thing. In the real world, there is no real battlefield with even forces. Asymmetry is the nature of the day. And that meant in historical wargaming, it's the same way. A lot of historical missions for historical wargames are built with asymmetric forces. And it flows out from there. Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer 40k both have asymmetric missions in their narrative mission packs, and it occurs all the time in some of the Horus Heresy books. So when the narrative missions were being written
for Titanicus, they inevitably appeared as well. And there are some really fun missions that have huge force differentials in them. The Last Stand at Magma City mission, found in the core rulebook, has an 1,000-point difference between the forces. This is a huge amount. This is like an additional mana pool worth of activations. And yeah, the game is designed to be that the defender's going to lose. But it's going to happen really quickly, and a lot quicker than the game thinks it's going to, because of that activation advantage. So your first step when looking at a mission you want to play is look at that battle group, look at those points, and decide whether you want a game where the advantage is going to be so heavily pushed to one opponent over the other. Now, if you and your opponent are all cool with it, that's great. But you've got to be pretty clear at that point that you're okay with one side having a real handicap. And this can be fine in the right circumstance. If you've got a player who really understands what they're doing and you've got another player who doesn't, perhaps giving them an extra 1,000 points will help, but it may not. But it's something you can play around with, and I don't think it's that problematic, providing you know what you're doing. If you just assume that the game's balanced, it isn't. And the amount of fun you may get out of the game may vary dramatically, especially if the person taking the smaller force thought they were in for more of a fighting chance. Set expectations, and you'll be okay. The next consideration when picking an enjoyable mission is the legios listed in the battle groups. A lot of the preset missions list the legios that fought that particular battle. And you and your opponent need to decide whether you have the collection to pull off that particular legio choice, or whether you're going to A, proxy your current collection for the legios mentioned in the mission, or B, swap out the mission legio for the legio you collect. If you do the latter, you do need to take a look over the special rules to see whether that's even viable. Quite a lot of special rules in the narrative missions are directly keyed in to that particular legio, or a particular legio special rule. And if that's the case, you probably shouldn't do that. But quite a few of the missions are probably ones you can swap legios out for very little effect. This is where the Echoes of Glory missions are really good, because they don't define the legios of the forces at all, which does allow you a lot more control. If you happen to discover a mission where you and your opponent have the necessary legios and the battle group disparity is something you can live with, you're on for a really fun narrative mission there. So I think that's something you should look out for, and I expect everyone already is. So I'm not going to labour this point, and I will move on. So the next point of discussion is deployment zones. Generally, don't worry about them. If the deployment zone looks a little odd, roll with it and see what it adds to the game. There's very few times where I think a deployment zone has destroyed a game. I think it has made games challenging, providing you're aware of how your forces work. Definitely something I've enjoyed messing around with myself, and I encourage everyone else to play with some unusual deployment zones. As I mentioned earlier, the Open War card deck has some really fun deployment zones, and if you're just looking at throwing yourself together a Open War card deck-like mission, flick through some of the books, pick a deployment zone you like, and say, let's try that with some random special rules, which I think we will move on to next. Then we get to mission special rules. For majority of the preset missions, they have a list of special rules, and they're generally all pretty good. But there are a couple of things you need to watch out for. The first of all are any rule that only applies to one player rather than the other. If a special rule only applies to one player, make sure there is another special rule that balances things. Play it out with you and your opponent before you start playing the mission. Make sure you're aware before you start putting models on the table about what you are both getting into. There's a difference between reading a rule and understanding a rule. And you can fall down a trap when you're playing any game that halfway through the game you realise the rules work a certain way, and you've made decisions expecting a certain thing to play out. And a lot of these preset missions are pretty complicated special rules. If you play one of those missions with the more complex rules, make sure you and your opponents both know how the rules are going to work. You don't want to be stopping at turn 4 to explain how this particular special rule will work to your opponent, and they've been utterly surprised by it. It is not going to lead to a good play experience or a positive game at the end of the day. I think this is a common point that I raise continually on the show. The same goes for vortex missiles, what have you.
The trick to having a fun game of Titanicus, or a fun war game at all, is communication. And when you're picking one of these preset missions, understanding that both you and your opponent fully understand those special rules is going to be key. It's also possible, and I've been there myself, where I can play a preset mission and I don't understand the rules, and neither does my opponent, and we end up stopping halfway through turn to reread the rules. Just read them, try and understand what they're doing, and if necessary, don't worry about the rules in the mission. Say, I see what they're trying to do here, let's just do this instead. Let's do this random modifier. Let's -1 of accuracy over 12 inches. Let's do this. Do not be afraid to simplify the special rules of a mission to make a game of Titanicus flow better. It's a really simple thing to do. I'm going to dig in the future back into some missions and discuss some of the special rules again. I know I did a few of them a while ago where I was digging into several of the narrative missions, and several of those missions are really wonderful, have some really fun gameplay mechanics, but they do change the nature of the game up. And as a bit of a tangent on this all, is also to mention that quite a few of the special rules will dictate that a mission is being done on a certain planet in reference to the Battlefields of Rise or the hostile battlefield rules in Titan Death. And when you do that, those rules have a habit of being that extra layer of complication, so don't be afraid to take stuff out. We're going to address those particular battlefield effects here in a minute. Then we moved to the section of the descriptions that describe how you're going to achieve victory in the game. My advice on picking a fun game of Titanicus is simple. Do not play a kill point based mission. While kill point games have a place, the games where you line up and destroy the enemy Titan, it is always fun to have a dynamic objective. Any game that gets you in a position where you have to decide, do I line my Titan up to get the perfect kill shot on the enemy, or do I do X to score victory points, puts you in a place where you have to make some really hard decisions, and that's the stuff that makes the games fun. Forcing you and your opponent to move your Titans around to be in less optimal killing positions leads to entertaining gameplay. Especially if the opponent doesn't quite know why you're doing something. Why do you put your Titan over there? You could have done something else. Oh, it's to do this and this and this and win the game. Leads to mad scrambles. The moments of joy I've had in Titanicus games have been like where I've seen an enemy warhound run around the flank of me thinking he's going for my rear and doesn't, because he's tailing it to the back of the table, and I quickly realise that, oh god, I've got to turn my entire force around to kill him, putting the rest of my army like showing their rears to the enemy's gun line, but if I don't do that, I'm going to lose the game. It's that sort of decision that's like really good and makes for some brilliant moments. And that's what you're trying to do with a game of Titanicus. You want to be forcing you and your opponent to not play the game by the books, and kill point games kind of push that direction. That said, there is a place for kill point games, and if you're playing several games in a day, it's always fun to throw one of those in, because occasionally it is good just to get in there and get for the kill.
And that sort of wraps up my thoughts on the preset missions. I think in the future I need to do a lot more deep dives into the individual missions and rate and review them separately, as there are some real clunkers and some fantastic ones, and they don't conform nicely to a simple box. Although I've sort of given you my guidance on what I think makes and breaks missions, sometimes you can break those rules I've just established and still have a really fun game. The trick is, as I sort of said, is knowing what you're getting into. If your opponents fully understand the mission and you come to the table with the right attitude, the game's going to be great. But a lot of these preset missions are not random pickup games. They are, as I've sort of said several times now, missions you are going to be planning and thinking about weeks in advance to make sure you have the right force. When done right and in the right spirit, all these missions are fun. When done as a pickup, yeah, you've got a little bit of a uphill battle to find one that's going to work. I know I've probably foolishly tried more than once to sit at my Games Workshop store and just flick through my book to try and find a narrative mission me and my buddy can play rather quickly. And generally, those missions are the ones that I've looked back and regretted. No, I've had some brilliant ones that have worked out, just enough to keep me coming back to try it again. But these days, with the Open Engine War deck, I don't think I'm going to be going down that road much more. Which takes me for a moment to reflect on the big difference between the Open War cards and the precepts and missions. Generally, they follow a very similar structure. Establish some special rules, establish a primary victory, establish a deployment zone. But the Open Engine War cards have that secondary objective, and I think it's important to recognise and return to that particular part of the deck is one of the ways the cards are so good. You're guaranteed to get some interesting, dynamic missions because you do not know what your opponent is going to be fully doing, and at the same time, while still knowing what the primary objective is. You aren't running in complete secrecy, but the opponent's still going to be able to pull some tricks out of his sleeve for scoring points, or may do something to surprise you on the table that may not make instant tactical sense, is where a lot of fun is. Fun's hidden in those moments. They're the moments that story's crafted, narrative occurs. And I think that's what we're all after in a good game of Titanicus, is some really fun stories, and plenty of chances to yell engine kill once or twice a game. At least, that's what I am here for anyway. So, let's move past the actual missions and talk about some other things you need to think about when putting together a game of Titanicus. So I just want to take a moment to talk about the problems with huge games in Titanicus. Whenever I talk about missions online, looking for suggestions for these episodes, people float the idea of me talking about apocalypse missions. How do you do 2-on-2 missions, 3-on-3? And I can't see a way to do it. I can't even see a way to talk about it for an entire episode. My experiments with playing 4,000 point games of Titanicus has generally not been great. The games are really good fun for about a turn, but they take a really long time to play. There's no great solution to fix the activation system. Doing the you go, I go system means you still spend forever activating every Titan. If you try and do 2 activations per round, so 2 players will activate 2 Titans simultaneously, you have all sorts of rules complications about what happens when they start targeting the same Titans start cropping up. I've even sat down and tried to come up with a system that would allow everyone to activate both sides of their battle force all in one go. So you would activate all your Titans, and then the enemy would activate all their Titans in the combat phase, with you then resolving all the damage at the end of the phase, similar to how they do it in 40k Apocalypse at the moment. But I'm not sure if that works that much better either. But I think that is probably the best solution if you want to play a 5-on-5 game. Just stagger it. So you're in the movement phase, you would activate a number of Titans equal to the same number of generals, you move them across the table, yada yada. And then in the combat phase, you resolve all catastrophic damage at the same moment. So your Titan could take a giant pounding, lose all its void shields, all its damage, get fully cored out, have maximum amount of critical damage, but it wouldn't be destroyed until you roll the dice at the end of the game. You would take penalties, obviously, if you took a lot of damage ahead of time before you activated. Maybe. It depends, again, how you would actually do the individual activations. Maybe you only take the critical damage that applied the turn before, so to represent everyone activating simultaneously. I think somewhere in that word salad of ideas is a solution to the 5-on-5 game. I just haven't seen it yet. And it's definitely not supported in the rule set as is, and someone needs to write a supplement, a homebrew supplement, to get it to work. And there is none that have been knocked around that I've tried that have worked enough for me to sit around and talk about it on the show. If someone is aware of a system to allow you to play 5,000 point games of Titanicus with 2 players on each side, let me know. Because every time I've tried, it's kind of failed. And at the moment, I'm not really willing to put much time and effort into trying to get it to work, and much time on this show to talk about how it could work. And like I say, it is a shame, especially as several of the narrative missions in this book start really pushing the upper bounds of what epic Clash games are supposed to be. The Last Stands at Magma City, for example, with their 1,000 point differential, means that if one side wants to take a decent force, you're suddenly facing down 3,000 plus points in Traitor Titans, which is problematic, to say the best. And with that, I think we'll bring this episode to a close. I haven't got any grand conclusions for this. At the end of the day, play the mission you want to play and ensure that you've communicated with your opponent. If both you and your opponent know what you're getting into, you're probably going to have a good time. And also, don't be afraid if halfway through a game the mission isn't working out, to change it, or to rack up and start again. playing a game out just to play it out if no one's having fun isn't worth the time in Titanicus. I don't think anyone plays Titanicus for money, so let's just focus on having fun while we do it. I hope my conversation about the Open Engine War cards is interesting and made you think about how you use them, and if you haven't got a deck, how you could come up with a very similar effect. I really do think it is the best thing that's happened to Titanicus in a long time. And with that, we'll look to focusing on the next show, which is going to be a conversation about the Iron Halo 2021 with my co-host Lucas. We're going to go over the event pack that I've been writing over the last couple of weeks. It's taken a lot of the ideas I've discussed in this episode and put it together into something fun and interesting. Even though we don't spend much time actually talking about mission design, I'm saving a lot of that for surprise on the day of. With luck, you will not be waiting that long between the release of this episode and the next episode. I know the gap between the last two episodes was slightly long. The start of the summer, as I feared, was a significant change in my lifestyle, and finding time to record the show had become a little problematic, alongside some writer's block I was having as I was putting this episode together, which I think in places you can tell I had. But I hope overall this episode's quality is great, and everyone enjoyed listening to it. If you have any feedback about the show, please email me or message me through Facebook or Instagram. I'm always willing to have a conversation about this show and ways I can improve. So until next time. Thank you again for listening to another episode of the God Engine Cast, a podcast dedicated to discussing the Adeptus Titanicus game produced by Games Workshop. This show was written, recorded, and edited by Martin Emery. This podcast is completely unofficial and no way endorsed by Games Workshop Limited. No challenge to any trademarks or copyrights are intended. All rights are reserved by their respective owners. If you have questions for the show, please email me at god.engine.cast@gmail.com or reach out to me through Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, where I am the God Engine Cast. Until next time, I wish you all well and good fortune.